Oh, well, but so many people like bike lanes. Well, yes, they do. Why? Because American people who ride bicycles have absolutely no knowledge of how to do it.
Cities all around the world are trying to become more bike-friendly by building dedicated infrastructure for cyclists, like on-street bike lanes and off-street bike paths. The ultimate contrarian take on bike infrastructure that comes up all the time is that none of this is necessary or even good. What we actually need to do is educate cyclists into sharing the road with drivers. In other words, riding in traffic. This sounds like something you'd hear from drivers quietly hoping that cyclists would just give up and get a car already, and sometimes that's the case. But it's also a genuine philosophy called vehicular cycling, or rules of the road cycling, best summarized by controversial advocate John Forrester and his line that
cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as drivers of vehicles.
The concepts of vehicular cycling are probably most familiar from cyclist education courses in the US and Canada.
Cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as drivers of vehicles.
But I'm not as big as a car, or as fast. How do I act like one?
You just need to know and follow 5 basic traffic principles. Come on, I'll explain them while we ride.
Okay, let's go.
Vehicular cycling actually has some good lessons for when you do have to ride in traffic, like staying out of the door zone just to the left of parked cars. The problem is when people argue that educating cyclists to ride in traffic is an alternative to building safe and comfortable bike infrastructure.
Why do they advocate something like bike lanes or other traffic calming things? They're all bad, just about.
Vehicular cycling is advocated by actual cyclists who have stories about how they bike a lot, many thousands of kilometers per year, in car-centric environments, and they have no problem. It's so common that I'm an avid cyclist, but I don't support these proposed bike lanes, has basically become a meme. Our response to people advocating vehicular cycling is always, okay, but how many other people bike like that in your city? A few adventurous individuals making it work is not a cycling success story. We're interested in building cities that encourage cycling and make it feel like a natural and obvious way to get around. Vehicular cycling always seems to be presented as an individual accomplishment, not a community one. I manage fine riding in traffic, and it runs contrary to everything we know about what kinds of environments get people cycling.
Study after study finds that people prefer cycling in lower stress environments and consider it high stress to bike in close proximity to motor vehicles, especially faster, heavier traffic. One study from Vancouver of current and potential cyclists found that off-street bike paths are the most popular type of bike infrastructure, followed by physically separated bike lanes on major roads in second place. In third place were quieter residential streets without bike lanes. The least popular environments that people were most hesitant to ride in were major urban streets without bike lanes, as well as rural roads. In these studies, there are always people who are happy to ride in heavier traffic without bike lanes, and some people even prefer it, but they're very clearly in a minority.
Lots of cities have automated bike counters that record actual bike traffic on different routes, which back up the idea that cyclists prefer separation and protection from cars. Here in Montreal, the busiest bike route according to the automated counters is St. Denis Street, whose spacious protected bike lanes welcomed 1.3 million riders in 2022. In Vancouver, the busiest bike counter is on the Seawall, an off-street pedestrian and cycling pathway that recorded 1.5 million cyclists in 2021. The busiest bike counter in the world that we've been able to find is Sebastopol Boulevard in Paris, a two-way cycle track that recorded 4.4 million cyclists last year. We're not aware of any bike counter finding large bike volumes in a vehicular cycling context where cyclists share lanes with motor vehicle traffic.
Another source of data is the Strava Global Heat Map that shows popular exercise routes all over the world. When you focus on cycling, it's clear that people on bikes have very particular preferences for where they ride that basically line up with bike lanes or off-street bike paths when they're available. In Paris, we can see that Sebastopol and the nearby Rivoli, which also has a bike lane, are lit up on the cycling heat map but not the running one. In East London, when you switch from running to cycling activity, two popular east-west routes clearly light up. These correspond to Cycleway 2 in the north and 3 in the south. Here in Montreal, cases where bike lanes split apart or switch to parallel streets show up very clearly on the cycling heat map. With Strava, you can find popular cycling routes that don't have bike lanes, especially scenic countryside routes used for bicycle touring. But usually these are local roads that don't have as much car traffic as a main highway. They also often have shoulders that work kind of like a bike lane. And when there is an off-road rural bike path, like Montreal's popular Petit Train du Nord here, cyclists clearly prefer it on the heat map.
Many countries collect data on commuting in their census, and the patterns are very clear. People are much more likely to get to work by bike if they live in an older, more urban neighborhood with slower car traffic and more bike infrastructure. Looking at the top 10 neighborhoods for bike commuting in Australia, 6 of them cluster in one specific older part of Melbourne, with smaller, quieter streets, bike lanes, and pathways. A whopping 7 of the top 10 census tracts for bike commuting in Canada are in Montreal, and not just anywhere in Montreal. The specific part of Montreal with the best bike infrastructure that we feature the most on this channel, including this video. Montreal wasn't always like this either. Bike commuting has steadily climbed since 1996, although the pandemic did disrupt the climb.
Many cities have other types of transportation surveys, and they also find a similar pattern. More car-centric suburban environments just don't encourage cycling. One study asked people in Greater Melbourne how often they rode a bike for any reason. The numbers were highest in the city of Melbourne, and they decreased with distance from the city, even though interest in cycling didn't.
And that's it. Vehicular cycling goes against all of the evidence we have about what environments actually encourage cycling. What gets people onto bikes isn't car-centric environments and telling them to act like motor vehicles. It's actually designing the environment for cyclist safety and comfort. So where does vehicular cycling come from? The biggest figure behind the concept was John Forrester.
Cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as drivers of vehicles.
Reading interviews and watching presentations from Forrester, he's a genuinely confusing and contradictory personality.
On one hand, he recounts learning to bike as a child in the 1930s, in a world where bikes were quickly going out of style. Cars were the future, and cyclists were seen as road lice for getting in the way. He frames bike infrastructure as a plot by drivers that cycling advocates have been tricked by to marginalize cyclists and get them out of the way.
The motorists invented the bike lane system, and they invented it for their own convenience on the excuse that cyclists were too dumb. Then comes the environmental group, and they believe all this stuff that the motorists have been telling them about being incapable of riding in traffic.
He continually comes back to this framing that he's fighting for cyclist rights and dignity against motorist supremacy and convenience.
The bikeways, particularly bike lanes, that were invented by motorists and were opposed by the cycling organizations at the time, those discriminatory anti-cycling things are now the subject of the bicycle activists' greatest propaganda activity.
At the same time, though, he criticizes cycling advocates as religious fanatics who are too anti-motorist.
Bicycle activists are not activists for the welfare of the people who ride bicycles. They are anti-motorists.
He criticizes traffic calming as mistreating drivers.
When you do nasty things for motorists through traffic calming, it's the poor cyclists who gets hurt worse than the motorists.
He's suspiciously friendly with driving advocates.
On the other hand, you might find people like me, and even he from the Motoring Association. We agree, cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as drivers of vehicles.
He complains that federal funding for bike infrastructure can't be used for general road maintenance.
They can't put bicycle money into simply improving the road. Fixing potholes, shall we say, fixing dangerous grates, or just simply widening the road and providing adequate capacity.
Beyond the confusing framing, one of his primary substantive criticisms of bike lanes is that they only protect cyclists in straightaway sections and not at intersections or conflict points. Talking about bike lane advocates,
They don't give a damn about the guy who comes at you and makes a left turn at you. That's the most frequent motorist cause of car-bike collisions. They only worry about the people coming up from behind who can see you perfectly well and most always miss you.
There actually is something to the fact that bike lanes don't address intersections. That's why cities are increasingly implementing things like bike boxes, advanced signals, and protected intersections. But just because bike lanes don't on their own solve intersections doesn't mean they're useless. A 2011 study compared 6 bike lanes in Montreal to comparable reference streets, finding 2.5 times higher cycling volumes and a 28% lower risk of injury, even though the two-way design studied isn't even considered best practice. Finally, building bike-friendly cities is not just about installing protected bike lanes or even protected intersections. There are other factors that we know make cycling safer. Slower vehicle speeds, higher cyclist volumes, smaller roads, better street lighting, and less on-street parking. Forrester acknowledged this. He just didn't like traffic calming. Referring to increased cycling and decreased injury rates in Portland, Forrester says it wasn't because of the bike lanes.
But why is that? That's not because of the bikeways, which have no reason, no physical reason that they reduce accidents. It's the fact that they've had all the other programs going around to slow down motorists, to make people bicycle conscious, and this kind of thing, and they're all confounding factors.
Let's say he's right. The bikeways encourage more cycling, which we know they do, and the other traffic calming measures improve safety. That sounds like a win to us.
Fundamentally, we just approach the topic of cycling very differently from Forrester. Our goal is to build bike-friendly cities that encourage people to bike and make it feel like a natural choice to get around. We look to places that have achieved success as models to follow: Portland, Montreal, Melbourne, and of course Denmark and the Netherlands. We're interested in both cycling volume and safety as our goal. It's possible that Forrester's idea of vehicular cycling did genuinely start off as fighting back against motordom, as he phrased it. But towards his later years, it's clear that he saw car-centric city design as modern, inevitable, and desirable. For example, his description of Amsterdam is not flattering.
Many people say, oh yes, Dutch bikeways are wonderful. Dutch bikeways, and they got a 40, 50, 60% bicycle mode share in Amsterdam. Well, sure they do. It's a medieval city. It's a pre-automotive obsolete city. Isn't that a nice word? And where motoring is extremely difficult. Well, you can't park your car at home because there's no place to park it.
He's just plain wrong here. The Netherlands is also bike-friendly in its newer developments. And Dutch people will tell you that the touristy center of Amsterdam isn't even among the better places for cycling in the country. Here's a random suburban neighborhood on the southeastern edge of Amsterdam right beside farmland that no one would mistake as medieval or historic, but is still crisscrossed with the distinctive red pavement of Dutch bike paths. And there's even car parking around the houses. You can say the Dutch make driving somewhat more difficult, for example by failing to demolish half of the central city to build highways and surface parking, but there's nothing inevitable, enviable, or balanced about the extent to which North American cities remade themselves to prioritize fast and convenient driving over everything else. Regardless, Forrester seemed to take a car-centric environment as a given, something that we can't and even shouldn't change.
He then argued that naturally the best way to bike in this context is to follow the established rules of the road and ride your bike like you would drive a car. Anyone who doesn't want to do this must be irrational or too dumb to know how to drive.
Did you know that here you are, Stanford graduates and all that, did you know that straddling a bicycle destroys your brains? It turns you into children who don't know how to drive.
He was really harsh and dismissive of people who didn't want to bike in traffic, because he saw it as fundamentally irrational given how safe he believed it was.
You can say, well, why don't you act like drivers? And they say, well, we don't want to.
The safety debate can be a rabbit hole. We can point to the astonishingly high injury and death rates for cyclists in the United States compared to Denmark or the Netherlands. But he can say that American cyclists aren't properly following his vehicular cycling teachings.
These rules aren't arbitrary, but are based on careful reasoning. Generally speaking, a driver who intrudes into the path of another driver must yield.
But even if we grant him that and assume that a theoretical vehicular cyclist can ride in heavy traffic safely, we're still left with the fact that most people just don't want to do it. And we don't think that's rational. Walking down a busier, faster road like this one in Ottawa, We don't think there's a massive chance of a car veering off the road and hitting us on the sidewalk, but we still find it loud, stressful, and unpleasant to have traffic zoom by so close. This environment discourages people from walking. Getting on a bike and joining this traffic doesn't make the experience any better. It makes the experience worse, even if somehow you could guarantee that we're not going to get hit.
And that's our fundamental problem with vehicular cycling being used as an argument against building dedicated bike infrastructure. It's hyper-focused on the theoretical safety of a trained cyclist, ignoring the reality that most people just won't ride in traffic, especially heavier traffic. When they do, they frequently won't be comfortable taking the lane or following the other theoretically safe recommendations of vehicular cycling. And even when cyclists do follow best practices, they're still at the mercy of mistakes or carelessness on the part of operators of multi-ton vehicles that can easily kill them. This protected bike lane in Montreal was installed just a few years ago, partly in response to a cyclist's death in this underpass in 2014 underneath a truck. She was an experienced cyclist, and deemed by the coroner as being completely not at fault for the collision. But it happened anyway, and she died because bikes just don't mix well with big trucks, especially in a context like this. After the installation of the protected bike lane, this quickly became Montreal's busiest bike corridor, with well over 1 million riders a year, as we covered earlier in the video. And you have to be crazy to not see why cyclists prefer navigating this vulnerable position in their own concrete-protected lane compared to sharing the space with deadly vehicles. We're going to end this video with another apparent contradiction in John Forrester's view of cycling. While he vehemently opposed building bike lanes,
They're all bad, just about.
he actually wasn't against wider traffic lanes that cars and bikes could share, and he recommends riding just to the right of cars when these are available.
Put a little bit extra width in the edge of the road, and he'll use it enough of the time that traffic can get by. And when it comes up to intersections and right turns and left turns, he'll do the right thing, and motorists can still get by him.
What he stubbornly opposed was any space on the roadway being dedicated to bikes, to the exclusion of cars.
Providing adequate capacity, provided it is not specifically allocated for one mode rather than the other, is a good thing. And these people, they hate that. They hate the idea that doing something good for cyclists might also improve motoring. And that's one of the big political arguments in the cycling world.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.